Accessibility and creative intent aren't mutually exclusive. Let's have a real conversation about that. Once again, the discussion around difficulty in games has come up in the mainstream. And once again, volatile arguments have arguably transcended the actual conversation to become the figurehead of the discourse at large. It really doesn't need to be this way. We can have a civil and fruitful talk about game difficulty that actually moves the industry forward. Unfortunately, those with the furthest reaching voices on both sides often struggle not to jab and poke at the other until war breaks out. Things really blew up again when a freelance writer by the name of David Thier, hopefully I'm saying that right, wrote an article for Forbes about From Software's recent game, Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice. As per usual, From's Souls-like title is considered to be noticeably challenging due to its refusal to pull punches. Therefore, it was only a matter of time until someone called the game out for the difficulty, arguing that it's exclusionary in nature. Mr. Thier led this charge with an article entitled Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice needs to respect its players and add an easy mode. Clearly inflammatory title aside, because who knows whether Mr. Thier himself came up with it, I don't think there's anything wrong at all with having this discussion. However, I don't personally feel that Mr. Thier nor the people he's targeting really want to have said discussion. Most of the meaningful discussion I've seen is coming from game developers, people who need accessibility options, and also those who are involved in the realm of accessibility in games, like Ian Hamilton. So, in other words, people who know far more about this topic than either Mr. Thier or I likely do. So if you want to really get to the bottom of this discussion, look toward them. Why? Because it's far more complex than most people are making it out to be. Links to several articles and resources are in the description. If it wasn't already clear, I don't think the Forbes article is terribly great, but the reason is actually because I feel his piece has almost nothing to do with From Software or their games being respectful of players, nor does it have as much to do with accessibility as it tries to allude to. I think this is a mask it wears, intentionally or otherwise, so that Mr. Thier can discuss why he feels the Souls community is disrespectful. Obviously, making an article about how trolls are trolls isn't particularly professional or useful on its own, so it had to be positioned as something more thoughtful. Thing is, I can actually agree with the sentiment to a large degree. While a lot of the Souls community is great, there is a loud, toxic undercurrent of people who see the series as nothing more than a status symbol they can use to bully others. It's important to realize that, though the toxic community members are really loud, most people who enjoy the challenge of From Software games aren't wary of easier modes because they would allow plebs to join their exclusive club or whatever. Mr. Thier implies this, and the deafening roars of these few trolls combines with the tentative agreement of the uninformed to give the impression that there's a giant mob of people who want to gatekeep the series. But in my experience, the qualms of the core fanbase as a whole instead stem from their understanding of how valuable and beautiful the experience of these games can be with the intended challenge the way it is. So, from those I've talked to, they aren't against variations in difficulty, so much as they would usually prefer alternative difficulty options to retain as much of that experience as possible. The same sentiment would hold true if Souls offered super hard alternative modes outside of the New Game Plus ladder. It would have to make the game more difficult in a way that doesn't dilute the experience. Either way, the goal these fans have in mind is retaining the core experience, because as players they understand the value of it. Again, just to be clear, most of us don't believe that an alternative experience can't be equally as valuable, but you can hardly blame people for wanting to share the exact experience they found so addicting with others. When someone enjoys a metal cover of your favorite pop song, that can be great, but it's also not the same song. Pretending it is naive. Thing is though, games are an interactive medium. As such, it's rather ludicrous to assume that one type of design is guaranteed to fit everyone, so it's important to think of ways to broaden the horizons of an experience. It doesn't always have to dilute said experience, if it's done well. In fact, many players are regularly up in arms when games on PC don't allow for mods, which is really no different from accessibility. If you've ever removed the accuracy system from Morrowind so that when you hit an enemy, you actually hit them, you are to some extent changing the vision of the work to accommodate your tastes or needs. Sometimes you can do that to fix something you feel is broken. Other times you do it simply to fit your personal tastes better. But the point is, we would all prefer to be in charge of how we interface with the games we play to some extent, even if some of us pretend otherwise. Making games inherently means giving at least some control of your art to the player. Period. So great developers think ahead and try to accommodate for this themselves. They know their games best, so the hope is that they also know how to best create accessibility options without compromising their intended experience. Imagine if your favorite musician only allowed you to listen to their music with Beats headphones. Wouldn't that be insane? Why should it be up to them to force me to buy overpriced garbage just to listen to their music? Even if you got the headphones for free with the album, it would be stupid. Why should it be different in games? I'm all for accessibility options and different difficulty modes in games if they're done correctly. Though I've never used the feature myself, I'm glad that recent Rockstar games like GTA 5 allow players to skip portions of missions they're struggling with. I'm glad their games offer a lock-on mechanic, as well as online servers specifically for people who want to use the lock-on. I like that Devil May Cry offers the easy automatic option. I'm glad many Nintendo titles in recent years have had total invincibility power-ups, or options that skip levels for the player while also showing them how it can be completed if they choose to try again later. I think every game should allow for fully customizable controls. Celeste's accessibility options are great too, which is something Mr. Thier brings up in his article. But I don't think discussing the topic purely as it relates to including an easy mode is terribly helpful. Difficulty is subjective, since it relies on the relationship between the challenges crafted by the designers and how these challenges may manifest as barriers for different players. You may be excellent at timing dodges, but someone else might struggle at it, or may not even be able to do them at all. As such, I've come to see accessibility and these challenges as two sides of the same coin. The challenges are the intended design developers present to the player, or as Ian Hamilton puts it, the framework of the experience. Accessibility options allow different types of players to interface with these challenges in a way that reworks the difficulty to fit their needs. If a game is inherently more difficult for you due to a disability or something, why shouldn't you be given the chance to level that playing field so that it's more similar to what other people experience? So when you get down to it, even when the Forbes article is on topic, it still feels like it's swinging at the wrong issues, or oversimplifying things. The biggest problem I and a lot of other people have seen with this article is the idea that if Mr. Thier doesn't personally see something as an accessibility option, the game must be disrespectful. He largely ignores the realities of trying to make art for certain niches, but more so, the article acts like From Games don't already include many options for difficulty management built into the games already. Not that they couldn't do way more, mind you. They definitely could and should, but it's not like they ignore difficulty options altogether. Mr. Thier briefly mentions summoning in previous Souls titles, which was taken out of Sekiro, but he ignores the effect of things like different character build options, the effects of many of the rings they usually offer, secret ways to deal with certain particularly challenging areas or enemies, etc. They don't always do it well, but it's not like From doesn't try to give players options for making their games more accessible if players need it, as I'll illustrate a bit later. But first, we've got to back up a bit and explore the idea of authorial intent a little. I don't think anyone would argue that a horror game needs to have a no scare mode in order to be considered respectful of its players. Sure, in some games that can be a cool addition, but just like the challenge of From Software games is intrinsically tied to the feel and tone they're trying to convey, the fear elicited by a horror title is at the core of what it's trying to do. Not every game has to or even can be for everyone, and it's indisputable that removing the horror in a horror game changes the game, even if there are many other things about said game that can be engaging for a player. As another short example, you may be able to translate Shakespeare's strange use of language into something more people can comprehend, but even at its best, you're still losing something unique to the work and the way it was told. This isn't always something to be avoided, but it is something that needs acknowledging. However, it's vital that we also note that this is never an excuse to avoid trying. Maybe a horror game could have an option to turn off jump scares, but keep the rest of the horror in if that's what bothers a lot of their players in particular. Quite a few games include options to turn off blood and gore for similar reasons. As much as I would love to play a game like Subnautica, I can't deal with the fear of open bodies of water it strangles me with. But I also understand that a mode that removes the underwater threats would undercut a large portion of what the game is trying to accomplish. Assuming I could somehow get past the still crippling fear a no threat mode would undoubtedly burden me with, I would still enjoy that experience, but it's not the same experience. The question isn't whether this is okay, because it is, obviously. There's nothing wrong with offering alternative experiences. The question is, if you're trying to offer as many players as possible the same type of experience, how can you go about accomplishing this? The idea that the unwavering fairness of a From game is at the core of the experience is an old argument I'm sure we've all heard before. But it's true. These games are designed to not give the player more power than the enemies they're going up against. It's not supposed to be a power fantasy. But if you can't physically overcome a disadvantage due to something like a disability, then the terms of this unwritten agreement are no longer being met. The game is no longer fair for that person. It's important for players to understand that playing games with a disability of some sort already adds challenge to the games. Often these challenges can be far greater than anything the game itself can throw at you, so the best course of action is creating options that allow players with these disabilities to manage that difficulty. An option that may make a game significantly easier to you or I might be just the right amount of challenge to someone else, and even then, a completely able person who just wants an easier experience, maybe because they're not that good or whatever, should be able to have that too. Again, the key in relation to games like Sekiro is trying to give them the same experience despite these changes. The designers can't possibly make the game work for everyone, so the other side of that proverbial coin is allowing players to meet the game halfway. That being said, it's rather silly that Mr. Thier makes it sound so easy to create properly balanced difficulty modes and options by saying, an easy mode doesn't have to change the core experience in any way, at all, period. Further along, he even says, but all you need to do is turn up the damage the player does and turn down the damage the enemies do. That's it. And yet I'm sure that most players who experiment with multiple difficulties in games would agree that a large portion of alternate difficulties fail spectacularly at this. Why? Because they usually don't give players enough options. Sometimes it's because developers don't have the time to balance the game properly for each mode. Other teams might find it nearly impossible to translate their mechanics in a way that makes the game easier or harder. Because yes, it's worth noting that just as many games have terribly balanced hard modes as easy modes. Point is, I'm sure most developers would agree that creating correctly balanced difficulties is much harder than the article is making it out to be. Balancing a difficulty isn't a linear problem. You can't just lower values and suddenly make a game work on an easier mode, or vice versa. It's about thinking laterally a lot of the time. If your game has a distinct rhythm that's at the core of the experience, let's say you have to defeat enemies fairly quickly in succession to build a combo meter, and your hard mode gives twice as much health to enemies, the whole experience may break down entirely without many other changes to compensate. I'm sure Mr. Thier knows this, so it's puzzling that he uses that idea as shorthand to support his point. When Dark Souls heavily relies on how insignificant the player feels mechanically to portray how dark, dead, and impartial the world is, creating accessibility options that retain this tone suddenly becomes a much greater task than one might think. It has to somehow meet the needs of the players in question, while still not turning the game into anything resembling a power fantasy. If the player can get into a state of flow that allows them to stomp on challenges, or if certain strategies override the available variety in a way the player doesn't intend, the tone of the entire world breaks down. And the thing is, any change you make to a single system can unintentionally cause that entire framework to collapse. Let's assume you lowered the damage that enemies do in Bloodborne. It doesn't have to be by a huge amount, just something significant enough to make a difference for people who need an easier option. Well, that change doesn't just affect how many hits the players can survive before they die, even though that's what you may be shooting for. Suddenly, they can also use the rally system much more effectively, since it would take fewer retaliations to undo damage done to you. That would in turn mean you're using less blood vials as well, since it's safer to go for longer without using them. On top of that, hyper armor becomes much more effective, and your damage dealing potential, though unchanged, is also much higher because you can stay on the offensive for longer. So many things change as a result of just adjusting the damage enemies do. Again, it's simple to say an easy mode doesn't have to change the experience. It's much harder to actually make that happen. Developers need to get clever. Instead, maybe the game could offer an option that allows for a few seconds of slow motion after the player gets hit, so that they can better prepare to choose the correct option as a response. Or maybe they could offer a rune you can equip that lowers the amount of echoes lost when the player dies. This would be highly effective for players who are really struggling, especially when it comes to limiting the grind needed to gain more blood vials. But as anyone who has played Bloodborne knows, many other runes would overtake that in terms of usefulness if you're much more skilled at the game, meaning it's valuable for players who are struggling without becoming a crutch for those that aren't. These are more difficult to implement, however, than just adjusting damage values, but they also better suit the experience and give more of the control to the player. You can kind of think of this in a sense like you think about graphics options on PC. Everyone has different hardware, so as long as everyone can understand what each graphics option does, and the options are well implemented, why would anyone want less graphics options instead of more? When people complained about life gems and how easy they made Dark Souls 2, I agreed with them, but not because life gems made the game easier. Instead, I agreed that they were an issue because they broke down the core value of many of the other systems. The problem was that life gems created a very lopsided optimal strategy where, whether you were great at the game or really struggled with it, the best choice in many cases was just to spam gems, tank hits, and mash the attack button. Very little else mattered once you got that pattern down, since gems were so powerful, meaning all of the rest of the mechanics went to waste. The alternative solution I proposed a few years ago was to treat life gems like Estus flasks. They'd instead refill at bonfires, and you'd have to find pieces of gems to create more for your inventory, and you could only carry a small amount at a time. That way they can't be abused, but they still provide the benefits unique to them for anyone who wants to use them. Funnily enough, Dark Souls 3 did something like this later, by allowing players to choose whether they want to have access to more Estus flasks or Ashen Estus flasks. Obviously, having more regular Estus makes the game far easier for most builds, but having more Ashen Estus makes your damage dealing potential much higher. But that's not a simple toggle that you can just create in an afternoon. Interestingly, Dark Souls 2 offers a lot of in-game organic difficulty options, which Mr. Thier ignores in favor of just mentioning summoning, mostly so that he could poke at Sekiro for removing it. But as the extra credits video, The True Genius of Dark Souls 2: How to Approach Game Difficulty, mentions, there are options like the Ring of Soul Protection. Unlike in Dark Souls 1, this ring doesn't permanently break if you die with it equipped. Instead, it has a repair cost, but the trade-off is that you don't lose any souls upon death while wearing it, nor do you lose your humanity, meaning your maximum health doesn't fall and you can still summon. On top of this, killing an enemy around a dozen times removes them permanently from the game. This means, if you continue to struggle, the difficulty still eases up when you prove that you can at least conquer an area repeatedly. These are just a couple examples of the organic difficulty built into the title. But there are ways for the player to also ratchet up the difficulty if they want instead. The Covenant of Champions removes the enemy despawn mechanic, meaning enemies respawn eternally, like in the other games. It raises the difficulty of enemies, disallows summoning, but still allows invasions, and increases the range at which enemies detect you. You can continue to make it even harder with bonfire aesthetics, which raise the level of an area up to the next New Game Plus level. Or you can use the Agape Ring, which absorbs all souls you would normally gain. Meant for co-op purposes, this ring can allow for no soul runs. These are all examples of ways to tailor difficulty naturally, while not transforming the experience entirely. Kingdom Hearts 2 is fundamentally a different game when you go from normal to critical or proud. I believe the easier difficulties in KH2 fail to retain the experience the developers wanted the game to have, hence why things were reworked and critical was added in the final mix version of the game. Thing is, there's a reason that critical mode offers the player several extra abilities to start with, which you don't get on easier difficulties. And it's because these were needed to compensate for some of the changes they'd made elsewhere in the mode, including just buffing your damage to the point where the only other mode where you can do comparable damage is on beginner. Sure, you could see these extra abilities as a crutch, but when you break the design choices of the game, and specifically the mode down, they are invaluable for crafting a more engaging difficulty that tests the specific skills that the game intends to test. And what's even better, you don't have to use these abilities if you don't want to. Same with the no experience ability it offers, which allows you to complete the entire game at level 1 if you're insane like I am. That's not to say that people can't enjoy one experience over the other in Kingdom Hearts 2, or in other games. If Souls had an easy mode that completely deteriorated the intended challenge and everything that came with it, nobody would be wrong for enjoying that mode, or even enjoying it more than the standard mode. But that is not the same argument as saying that you can create an easy mode that doesn't damage the intended experience. The former posits that an experience can be multiple things to multiple people. The latter says that the experience should aim to instill the same feelings into everyone who plays it, regardless of the options they choose. And in the case of Mr. Thier's article, sometimes it feels like his stance disrespects the art of game design by diluting the intense work involved into just changing a few values under the hood. Optimally, we should be able to have both, but that often depends on how integral a sense of difficulty is to the experience. So which option a developer chooses to go with for their game will depend on the goals of the game, and the time or budget they have. I truly think they should at least always try, though. I also think the section of Mr. Thier's article that references fans who argue that an easy mode would ruin the normal mode in From Software games, yeah, that's a straw man argument. He doesn't really go deeper into examples of why people would hold such a silly belief, and his vague nature here makes sense, since the only argument I've heard that fits his description, and isn't just posturing from trolls and lunkheads who don't deserve your attention, is the idea that all the work it would take to create great accessibility options will ultimately take away from the game as a whole. The idea is that we already know developers are abused and pushed beyond realistic standards during development, so handing them another demand in the form of accessibility options will only make things worse. This may or may not be accurate in many cases, it's hard to say, but if anything, that's just another reason for studios to adopt dedicated accessibility departments for their teams. If they plan for accessibility early on and budget it in, there's no reason why it would ever be the linchpin that decides the overall quality of a product. As such, that argument, while decently level-headed, is also based on assumptions and fallacies. But again, it's really the only argument that I've seen regularly from level-headed people that kind of fits Mr. Thier's description of fans. As I've said before, From games aren't that brutal, and by that I don't mean that they go easy on players. They're definitely intended to challenge players for sure, but a large portion of the challenge comes from the fundamentally different language of play they use from other types of games. The huge first steps, even for those of us without disabilities to contend with, are mostly related to learning what the game wants from you, and unlearning habits from other experiences that don't work in a Souls game. This is really no different from someone, say, learning to aim and to move naturally in a first-person shooter, or transitioning from arcade racing games to simulation racers. Learning that language of play initially makes the cliff seem steeper than it actually is. This concept of language of play is something I've brought up in a lot of my videos, because I think it's important for understanding when a game is unfair in its design, when it is fair but poorly explained, or when the problem is actually entirely on the player's end. A lot of people are arguing that Sekiro is far more challenging than Souls games usually are, and they said the same thing about Bloodborne as well. But after a while, the consensus shifted to instead arguing that Bloodborne generally provides more lenient challenges than Dark Souls 1 or Demon's Souls. This is because the understanding of the mechanics, the enemies, and general design of the game grew, which revealed how much softer Bloodborne goes on players at times. People learned its language. That's not to say it's easier, mind you. Just that once people learned the language it was using, they realized that the player had a lot more options at their disposal at any one time for dealing with challenges. The example I usually refer to for language of play discussion is simulation racers, which is something that the no-clip video on accessibility in Sekiro also touches on. I also play a lot of sim racers, and have for about a decade and a half now, so I'm extremely comfortable with the language they use. Within simulation racing communities, the single-player races are often known to be insanely easy, but to people who don't play simulation racers, often even just taking a single corner without ending up in the tire wall can be extraordinarily difficult. In my video specifically about language of play from a few years back, I reference this example and discuss how I feel Gran Turismo really works with players to teach them the rules of the game and its physics. Where several other sim racers have assists that can effectively turn a simulation racer into an arcade racer, GT tries to ease you into understanding the game on its terms with things like license tests and special events. But at the same time, GT still offers assists of a multitude of types, from racing lines to setting cones at the apex of corners to traction and stability control, and even to more unrealistic effects like skid recovery force. Some of these do change the game on a pretty fundamental level, but the important thing is that all of them are carefully tailored to getting players to be more and more confident, so that maybe one day they can eventually leave some or all of the assists behind. They don't want you to keep using the assists forever if you can avoid it, but they'll allow it if you really need it. Therefore, teaching the game's language is important, not only so players can understand what accessibility options they may need, but also for hopefully allowing them to eventually do as much as they can without the need of these options. This might specifically be something that From Software should look into. Mr. Thier's choice to position From titles as punishingly difficult games that set a new standard for how much abuse the modern player was able to take is not only needlessly dramatic, but also intellectually dishonest to a degree once you acknowledge how challenging many great games of the past can be, and how well they teach their languages. It implies that games like Super Meat Boy or Mega Man X, or Gran Turismo's license test before this, among many other examples from all ages of games, are inherently easier and From's games have a particular penchant for beating players down intentionally. Despite multiple examples of Hidetaka Miyazaki talking about how he's always wanted to make fair games that make players feel accomplished, not hard games. Mr. Thier's position seems to conflate the egos of the trolls with the goals of the series, which just isn't fair. It feels dishonest, since I'm sure Mr. Thier would also more than likely agree with the idea that difficulty is largely subjective, as we said before. If that's true, who is he to pin some sort of masochistic theme to From's game design? The marketing? Sure, but not the design itself. The wording used in the article might seem more innocuous if instead it was in a piece about the series in a more general sense, or the way the world saw the series. But in an article specifically criticizing From and claiming it disrespects players through their supposed obsession with unrelenting difficulty, he might want to pick how he colors his sentences more carefully. Listen, I don't want to imply that Mr. Thier wrote this article with the central goal of starting a war, so to speak. I think he does indeed care about what he's trying to discuss. But I also feel like he let his disdain for certain forms of toxicity overtake his goals. So half the article reads more like a rant about From fans, and less like a reminder that the relationship between games and players is complicated. It feels misleading. In my opinion, accessibility options are best when they're clearly illustrated as options that can accommodate different players and play styles, or when it's well established that they may disrupt the intended experience. Not to separate normal players from the other, even just saying that makes me feel really gross. Rather, I think this is important to make clear when an option may change the experience. A player isn't going to know what difference each option will make to the experience before they play the game, but the developer will, so they should illustrate that properly in the menu, and let players choose from there, maybe even let them experiment with the game before they start. I think every game should have as many accessibility options as they can fit. There is absolutely no reason not to allow as many people as possible to play the game. Difficulty modes specifically, meanwhile, already come with a host of problems related to how people psychologically perceive them. As extra credits and many others have talked about before, some people might feel pushed to pick an easier difficulty than they should due to things like self-confidence issues. Others may feel pressured in the opposite direction, like they have to pick harder difficulties in order to get the true experience, even on the rare occasion that every difficulty is balanced correctly to offer that same experience. But this can be combated in-game in several ways, from allowing people to change the difficulty mid-game without punishment, to giving extensive breakdowns of what each difficulty mode changes, or making the name and description of each difficulty encouraging rather than discouraging or neutral. But if you ask me, the most important thing is really telling players what experience a difficulty or option is intended to offer, if it doesn't offer the same experience as the others. Don't try to tell players what type of person might want to play that difficulty. Just tell them what it does to the experience so that they can make their own informed decision. That's why things like the story difficulty modes in BioWare games are great. They're an intentionally different experience intended for people who just want to focus on the story, and it's made crystal clear that that's what it's for. From what I understand, Assassin's Creed Origins included a sort of museum mode known as the Discovery Tour that allows you to go on a history tour using the game's engine and world. You know what the response was from people? Instead of complaining that it ruined the game, they wanted more. They wanted a mode that removed all of the quests and leveling and everything, and just allowed the player to explore the world without worry of dealing with the more challenge-oriented mechanics. I'm personally not that interested in Assassin's Creed as a game series, and even less so with the RPG mechanics they've introduced in the recent games, but I will eventually pick up Origins for this Discovery Tour mode, and I can't help but to imagine future games retaining the parkour mechanics and full exploration the normal mode has, while including hidden history tokens across the entire game map that reward exploration with snippets of historical information. This sort of thing adds value and meaning to the experience for everyone, while giving people who want or need an easier version of the game a way to be included. Think about it. The problem everybody's complaining about is only going to get worse if From simply offers a generic easy mode and then leaves it at that. If we're realistic, that'll just shift the edgelord bullying from, "Oh, you used summons? You're a pleb," to, "Oh, you played on easy mode? You're still a pleb." But if instead it was a series of options in a menu titled Accessibility Options, or positioned as a mode called a World Exploration Mode that even the hardcore players could enjoy for what it does differently, I think you'd not only see less chest pounding from people, but also a lot more of a willingness from these people to help improve these modes for their own benefit. Instead of fighting their selfishness, why not turn it into something positive? Not that everything has to go in that direction. Again, all of this talk is just focused on trying to illustrate the different ways developers can include options and how they don't have to position it as a vanilla easy mode. These can be presented purely as accessibility options, they can be treated like an alternative mode that allows every player to play in different ways, or it can even have the super intense, difficult work put in required to create an alternative mode that still retains the core experience. There are many ways to allow for loads of new people to experience a game. But I feel it's ultimately not helpful to treat accessibility as if it inherently dumbs down an experience, nor is it right to imply that properly balancing difficulties is akin to just adjusting a few EQ sliders, and therefore anyone who's concerned about what they may do to a game is a toxic bully who just wants to lord their accomplishments over others. It's complex to get right, but it's also worth getting right. Ultimately, neither you or I should get to dictate how someone else may want to enjoy the game they bought. That's a metaphorical contract they enter into with the developer and nobody else. The conversation may have grown extra hostile this time around, but maybe this video will help course correct a bit, and even if it doesn't, there's always next time. Hopefully, people like Mr. Thier can set the conversation off on the right foot when From eventually releases another Souls-like experience. But what do you guys think? Did you agree with the Forbes article? How do you think games can balance for a variety of players? Do you have any accessibility ideas that you haven't seen others mention? Share your thoughts down in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.